And welcome to Feminist Question Time, which is brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, and which has been signed by 18,374 people from 137 countries and is supported by 345 organisations. Women's Human Rights Campaign has country contacts in 44 countries who are engaged in defending women's rights. If you'd like to get involved, have a look on the website and link up with your country contact. Or if there isn't one, you could become a country contact and help to spread the word in your country, and also keep an eye on what your government is doing in terms of legislation. I'm really pleased this week we have Camille Girard from France, from New Femme, and also WHRC France. They're the country contact for France. We have Sola from China. She's a feminist, and it's the first time that we've heard from feminists on women's sex-based rights and gender identity ideology and what's happening in China. So this is a really big moment for us, and it's going to be so interesting to hear from her. Iza Palinska from Poland, feminist activist, politician and publicist. And we've got Batya Weinbaum from USA. She's a feminist author and educator, founder and editor of the journal FemSpec, online instructor at American Public University. I'm going to pass over to Camille Girard from France, from New Femme, WHRC France. Over to you, Camille.
I will give you a summary of the second French-speaking webinar with the panelists from Quebec, Andorra, Switzerland, and France. The situation being, Stéphane Mitchell from Switzerland gave us a summary about how the WHRC founders created the sex-based declaration, for we are facing an erasure of the notion of sex in law in favor of the concept of gender identity politics and how it affects women and girls. So Clémence, who was a panelist from Quebec, she told us about the Moore case, and I found an article which I will quote. So in Quebec, Judge Gregory Moore, he invalidated several articles in the Civil Code, including the one that prevents a person from changing the sex listed and the list act of birth to reflect their gender identity. So he also struck down the provision that requires someone to be identified as a mother or a father on a declaration of birth, rather than being referred to as a parent. So according to the judge, the limitations of the Civil Code deprive trans and non-binary people of the dignity and equality that they are owed. The judge gave the province until the end of the year to amend the Civil Code. The Center for Gender Advocacy called the decision an important victory for the rights of non-binary individuals, trans parents, trans non-citizens, and trans youth. So the fight for justice and ensuring legal protection of all intersex, trans, and non-binary people is ongoing, and there clearly remains much work to do and to be done. The judge also ruled that people should be allowed to change their gender designation, even if they are not Canadian citizens, opening the door to permanent residents, refugees, and people without status. However, underage people still need to provide a letter from a physician, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, sexologist, or social worker if they want to change their gender civil status. So Clemence says that these changes in the law leave us with questions we can't answer yet, like what about the meaning of being a mother? The fact it changed the past of a child. What about if both parents disagree? What about the trans people? And also Quebec wants to make surrogacy a legal thing, and this ruling will make it easier. Then we had the panelists from Andorra who wanted to remain anonymous, and she reported the situation in her country. So Andorra is a small country which belongs to Spain and France. It's a kind of parliamentary monarchy, a co-principality between the Bishop of Urgell in Catalonia and the President of France. In Andorra, abortion is illegal. Women need to go to France or Catalonia if they can afford it. And even in case of rape, if the fetus is abnormal or if the mother's health is in danger. Now a woman is facing a retaliation for reporting the situation of women in Andorra. Despite she is not breaking the law, she is facing 4 years in jail. Until these days, there is no possibility to change the sex in the civil code, but this might change. And the press is saying that a parental consent might be enough for underage children to change their sex in civil status. For adults, we don't know yet. The bishop doesn't seem to disagree with this, as gender identity is already ruled by law to protect children from gender discrimination and the right to gender identity and gender expression. There is also a law to rule equality and to prevent sexism based on sex and discrimination against female gender and gender identity expression. So what we can say is Andorra society takes gender identity more seriously than women's rights. Gender identity is brought into the media, school, and university. So in Andorra, abortion is still illegal. Feminists can face jail. There is no possibility to change your sex in law yet, but law is replacing sex with gender and gender identity. Then we had Chandra from Switzerland. She made a summary of the situation of women and girls' rights in Switzerland. She spoke about the 2019 women's strike, which was inclusive for the adding an asterisk at the word women to include women presenting as to include men, presenting as women. In Switzerland, women can vote and be elected to parliament since 40 years and were given parental authority in 78. Sex-based equality was ruled 3 years later. So in oh boy, I forgot the word in French. In 1991, the first women's strike happened because the sex-based equality law was already 10 years old, but wasn't applied. Switzerland agreed to legal abortion in 2002, which is quite recent. In 2012, female genitation were illegal before it wasn't. Okay, the 2019 general strike was trans inclusive. Only cisgender men were unwelcomed. This year's feminist strike was less and less focused on women's rights, and even lesbians organizations are trans inclusive. So in Switzerland, like in many countries, women's rights and LGBT rights are mixed up. Gender identity was introduced in school and sports 10 years ago. About 5 years ago, they agreed to ease the sex change in civil status. And last year, they were preparing a new law for this year that will allow people, including underage children of 16-year-old. Actually, adults and 16-year-old teens, they can self-ID now. And there even was a debate about lowering the age to 12-year-old. To this day, a man who changes his sex in law remains a father. It doesn't become the mother. But gender identity is well set in school system, sometimes without telling it to the family. It's also set in medical area. Medical students are taught that sex is a spectrum, and media also promote gender identity. In France, we had Florence Imbert, a member of the Women's Assembly and French WHRC. So Florence, she focused on a material definition of sex and gender as a social construction and hierarchical system. She said the fight for human rights implies an end to gender hierarchy as a result of male supremacy, aka patriarchy. The acknowledgement of the existence of a magical feminine essence is a patriarchal myth to justify misogyny and has nothing to do with female biology. She explains that the concept of feminine essence or inner feelings bring us back 200 years ago, when male physicians used to dissect women's brains in order to find this so-called feminine essence and justify gender roles as being a natural thing. So since then, studies have proved many times, including with neurobiology, the inexistence of magical feminine essence, and that there is no such a thing as a female or a male brain. So it's about socio-cultural context. Patriarchy rules in a heterosexual system that discriminates women and lesbians for being gender non-conforming due to their sexual orientation. Lesbianism is a transgression of women's submission in patriarchy, and gays also transgress the male domination. Gender activists try to make us believe that being transgender is also about transgression, but it's not. Gender identity doesn't free people from gender roles, it worsens stereotypes, since transgenderism is about changing the body to match with the inner feeling of a gender identity. So there is a strong link between gender identity and gender roles, since patriarchy is based on a dichotomy between male domination and female submission. And this brings us back to the concept of a magical feminine essence, which doesn't exist. Gender ideology wants to base specific human rights on the inner and subjective concept of gender identity. So what changed in law in France? In 1992, a European Court of Justice condemned France for French law was seen as disrespectful. Back then, transsexuals reported that the assessments they were going through were intrusive and degrading. About 10 years ago, France removed transsexualism from the psychiatric illness list, which made the country the first to stop to see it as a pathology. So since transsexualism is, or gender dysphoria is no longer seen as an illness, there is no need to medicalize it. So there were no reason to keep it in the French healthcare system anymore. But trans activists succeeded in keeping that way. So what I want to say is transsexualism is not an illness anymore, but it still is seen as a long-term illness, and it's supported by the healthcare system, which is quite weird. So Florence reminds us that gender dysphoria is made up from gender stereotypes, and being a gender non-conforming is now pathological. But trans activists refuse the medicalization of gender dysphoria since psychiatric approach is seen as degrading, while they demand that the healthcare system supports this non-illness. So gender identity is a inner feeling of being part of the opposite sex or not, and this feeling must not be seen as a pathology, but still must be taken care of long-term illness by society. She also said that now in France, if an adult or an emancipated child wants to change the sex in law, all she or he needs is produce an assessment from family, friends, or co-workers. And Florence, she nailed it well when she said in English, the clothes do not make the man, but for trans activists, they make the woman, which is, yeah, it's clear. Then we have the privilege to have Michelle Vianès with us. She's the president of the French association Regard de Femmes, and she tells us more about the Yoga Carta principle and why they are already in French law, without the knowledge of French people, since there were never a public debate about public discussion about it. So she said, how was it possible, since French law requires a public debate, how is it possible that France endorses such principles as, for example, they're giving more credibility to a man than a woman, since a man can declare himself that he is a woman and have access to women-specific accommodation like lockers, toilets, and jails, and how it is linked to trans activist ideology. So, of course, there is a calling for compassion, but also from a part of gender activists, they will attack anyone who will disagree, and mostly women and lesbians. and they are using language and law as a double strategy to do it. So at the beginning, discrimination against women has a sex-based legal approach. Then there were an amendment, who offers the same protection to transgender people. For example, the law about sports access this year. In French law, gender identity is put before age and disability. And this is how this year the French Rugby Federation endorses men presenting as women in French rugby. And this takes place after the International Rugby Federation ruled that men presenting as women shouldn't compete with women based on security and fairness. In France, we had our first jail case. A woman succeeded in being sent in a women's jail by a legal procedure, thanks to the 2016 law. Until now, only transsexuals who had surgery were sent in a women's jail in France. So, of course, the prison guards, they protested through the syndicate, as they were told to body search a male inmate, because French law says that body searching requires a same-sex approach. In France, there is a law at the Assembly, and they want to penalize parents who doesn't support transgender kids, and this could be seen as an act of torture if you don't support your kid if she or he is trans. So this is very important to say because it's just, it's so wrong actually. They also want to remove the mention of sex in the act of birth. We talk about Marion Miller too in France. And what we are doing now is we are joining together to strike back and defend ourselves and support each other. And Nous Femmes is this is our aim.
So we're going to now move on to Sola. She's from China. She's a feminist. She's going to tell us about the situation with gender identity in China, what made her realize transgenderism was a problem, etc.
First, let me introduce to you about the traditional gender roles in China. With a history of more than 5,000 years, China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. Although matriarchy once existed when women enjoyed higher social status, Chinese history has seemingly obliterated the contributions made by females in ancient society. Since the monarchy was established in China, Confucianism had been adopted by emperors to control people's minds. It is a religion enforces gender roles. Different from other societies, besides motherhood and managing the household, women's roles in China was restricted by kinship relations, meaning women's whole life was controlled by men. By contrast, men were the heads of the family and enjoy much higher social status than women and children. The Confucian ideology still influence people today because Chinese government meets such moral standards, especially the principles related to obedience, to control its people. I'm not sure whether there was gender identity in ancient China, but there were castrated males who acted as important ministers in the palace. Next, we show you the picture. They didn't identify themselves as women because their biological sex still guaranteed them great superiority over females. Men only call themselves females when they can take great advantage from it. For example, there's a character called Dan, played by men cross-dressing as women in the Beijing Opera. Yeah, this is the picture of Dan played by males. This is because men traditionally play women's roles because women were not allowed to perform in front of the public and were limited to private and segregated space. I think this is what trans people are doing. They act as women and invade women's space. No matter how well they act, they're just acting. They're just playing the roles. Compared with the males' initiative in being castrated or acting as women characters, female infants were forced to dress up as males. They were made to cross-dress by their parents from a very young age, because in the past there was no transition surgery, but I think it's the same. Having the children live a transgender life completely go against the kids' personal wills. Nowadays, transgenders are not admitted in China unless they do surgeries over the age of 20 and apply for a new ID card and residence registration. With the popularization of liberal ideology among young people, LGBT communities in China continue to expand, and the number of people who identify themselves as non-binary keeps growing. Following the gender identity debate in the West, a large number of transgenders pop up and become active. It seems like we'll show you the pictures of these transgender males. It seems like they just want to take this opportunity to make fame and fortune. You can see from these pictures that all of these social media celebrities are trans males, and I have never seen any women bloggers who identify themselves as men. The next two pictures. Yes, these are all trans males. And I've never seen any women bloggers who identify themselves as men. So it is quite clear that these men are just using the self-claimed female identity to cheat the public. The message they send on the social media can mislead children who are confused by the concept of gender and hurt themselves. The message they send on the social media can mislead children who are confused by the concept of gender and hurt themselves. For the lesbian community, trans people are a hidden threat. Since they have no official physical LGBT groups or organizations in China, most lesbians can only communicate through dating apps or chatting apps. I heard about an episode that in a chatting group organized by a well-known lesbian blogger, some group members were being kicked out. They were being removed because they criticized a gay man who committed domestic violence to his wife. Later, it was found that one of the administrators of the group was a trans man who was apparently shielding his male compatriot by banning lesbians from the space that belongs to them. So we can see that trans men are completely different from the true females, the true lesbians. They only want to get the profit from being in a lesbian group. Unlike men who are entitled to choose to become women or even key opinion leaders on social media or celebrities, most women in China are struggling with the basic right to survive. You might have probably heard that China is allowing families to have 3 children and were surprised by the shift from strict one-child policy to the incentives on birth. These policies were equally disgusting because there is a blatant attempt of treating women as political tools and birth machines with no consideration of women's health and their rights in the family and workplace. I remember 20 years ago, when there was a strict birth control, the government will send supervisors to visit every household to find out if people overbear their children. My parents were very anxious about having a boy who will be the head of the family, but unfortunately, they bore 4 girls, my sister and me. We were lucky enough though. My parents didn't abandon us, so they have to let us hide behind the curtains to get away with fines. The supervisors didn't find us, but at the end, my mother was taken away for ligation. Many women were forced to do that surgery, and most of them suffered from inflammation with the IUD in their uterine. We will now show you the picture of the IUD in women's uterine. Yeah, this picture, which is only allowed, this IUD in their uterine is only allowed to be taken down a few years later. Nowadays, abortion can become difficult since the 3-child policy was enacted. In order to improve the birth rate, we don't know what the government will do. But women are already facing challenges when seeking a job. The employers are more likely to select a male candidate because the cost for hiring a woman is higher. The preference for men can be seen everywhere in this country. The most direct evidence might be the sex ratio at birth. The statistics of newborn sex ratio was not revealed in China's 7th population census, but it is estimated to reach 120 males per 100 females. As we mentioned earlier, Chinese family emphasize the kinship relations, where men are considered the only orthodox heir to the family. As we feel angry about parents who prefer boys to girls, we lament the 70 million female infants who were not allowed to be born into this world. Yeah, these are the statistics of the sex ratio at birth in China. The next one is about the sex ratio change between 1980 to 2009. Research have shown that the imbalance of sex ratio can result in the rise of crimes because males account for the majority of criminals. We have witnessed several vicious random killings and hate crimes last month. Women tend to be victims for their gender, and therefore we doubt that these were incel terrorists organized by the misogynists. But the media never display the essence of these crimes, and the criminals' sex were always hidden if males commit them. Laws are also biased when it comes to the violence committed by different sex. Recent news reported that a woman killed her husband with axes for the long-term domestic violence she suffered, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. But the sentence for men in a similar case is much lighter. The husband who pushed his wife to the river and made her drown was sentenced to only around 3-year imprisonment. So you can see the bias in it. Laws concerning sex consent age, rape, domestic violence are biased and incomplete because the government never takes women and children's human rights seriously. It is a male-dominated government after all. And now I will introduce to you about the radical feminists in China. Radical feminists are not welcome in a socialist country where feminism is considered as cultural invasion of foreign countries. They define this as foreign ideology. However, we view women's human rights as a common value and pursuit of human society and should not be restricted by country. China's radical feminists grew from social media while insisting on fighting against the traditional filial duties that females are supposed to obey, we have absorbed the essence of Western feminist theories and movement. Affected by the feminist movement in South Korea, many Chinese feminists have also followed the practice of 6B40, a non-violent, non-cooperative way of fighting against patriarchy. We have a dozen of radical feminist groups on Douban, a discussion forum similar to Reddit, where we expose the sins of males and the patriarch society. However, the groups were removed by the platform altogether at one night in April. 6B40 became a sensitive word and some feminist accounts were suspended because the ideas of rejecting sexual relations, marriage, reproduction with men violate the government's need for more labor force. So a lot of Douban refugees moved to Spinster, where I knew about WHRC and signed for the campaign. This is meaningful because we are also concerned about women and children's development around the world. Most Chinese radical feminists are gender critical and thus blamed as TERF and cursed by liberals and queers. Trans women can never be part of women because they were not born as women and they do not share the same experience as women. I will also talk about something about LGBT groups or women's rights groups in China. Well, currently we don't have any official LGBT groups or association because homosexuality is not accepted by the state and LGBT are still considered as sexual minority. We used to have some private associations, but they have to remain low-key these years because the whole political environment is getting harsher. Although there is an official All China Women's Federation established in 1949 when women were major labor force after the Second World War, its functions gradually weakened, and I don't think they actually did anything to protect women and children's human rights. It is official, meaning it represents the male-dominated government. In China, it is illegal for the public to express radical political opinions, demonstrate or have gathering, not to mention some campaign. Every move of the public is under close surveillance and strict censorship. So I have to share the screen without showing my face. Thank you.
Now we're going to move on to Iza Palinska. She's from Poland. She's a feminist activist, politician, and publicist, and is going to talk to us about what's happening in Poland. So Iza, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us what's going on in Poland on the issue of gender identity ideology?
I will be speaking on more broad and general terms because I believe that in Poland it is still very early in this debate. We are very early in this debate. And this is mainly due to the fact that we have a very conservative far-right government, and the ruling party's position is still quite strong. And I would say that we are nowhere near to losing this conservative government, which is unfortunately and sadly against any minorities' rights. So they are against women's rights, but other minority groups, they are actively against their rights also. So radical feminists' position is unfortunate because when talking about being against gender ideology or queer ideology, we are put in the same sack with these conservatives. Plus, for several years now in Poland, we have had this ongoing narrative and far-right political propaganda of gender ideology, but this gender ideology meaning something different than what we are discussing now. When they were referring to gender ideology for the last 5 or 7 years, I would say, they were mostly referring to the gender critical feminist discourse that was saying that strict sex roles are something that is harmful for both women and societies. So for now, I would say it's too early for the general public to understand and get this difference. And for now, because we are not at risk of having self-gender legislation like approved in the future, in the foreseeable future. So for this reason, the discussion that is ongoing in Poland is mostly the matter of a language discussion, of inclusive language, of course, because the trend is visible and is quite strong in liberal media and on liberal social media accounts that are quite thoughtlessly supporting anything that goes contrary to the narratives pushed by the ruling party and the government. So when the government is against gender or gender ID, the liberal opposition will take it everything to support it without even knowing or fully understanding what stands behind that.
Does the liberal opposition also take the pro-women's rights position, or are they just taking the pro-trans position? Like, are they standing up for the basic, women's rights?
You have probably heard about women's protests against this very strict anti-abortion law that was applied the last year, and it was called the Black Protest, and it was huge women's protest. So the movement unfortunately got hijacked by this pro-queer or pro-gender narratives, because the Women's Strike Council even prepared legislation on new abortion law that was supposed to be pro-women, that doesn't even include the word woman itself. Like, this is the same case as in Argentina. So I would say that declaratively, liberal opposition is very much pro-women's rights, but it's only on the surface. And when we go deeper, we can really see that there is not much of really understanding what women's rights are about deeper. Plus, sadly, I have to say that most of women's organizations in Poland are not voicing their support for women in this situation. They, in the best cases, stay silent in the whole discussion regarding wars on language and wars with TERFs. So, and my idea would be that it's because they are afraid of losing their funding sources, which are probably not coming from the ruling government, but they are coming from somewhere abroad, some foundations that are pro-queer and pro-trans agenda.
How about you, Isa? Have you been a feminist all your life, and what made you realize transgenderism was a threat to women's rights?
Yes, I can call myself a feminist since I only remember, so I am a feminist for all my life. And I did not see and I did not understand at first what stands behind this whole conflict. And the moment that I understood was the moment that I learned about self-gender ID doctrine. So this self-gender ID doctrine applied into law made me understand in a blink of an eye that women as a political group and like social group cease to exist, and that we as feminists in a sexist society cannot let it happen.
Do you sort of read like the internet? Like, do you get information from all over the world, or are you other places in Poland, like good sites that you follow?
Like the mix of news that my newsfeed on social media gives me from the selected sources. However, one of the first stages on this way was signing your declaration. So thank you very much for this, for preparing this document, because it's extremely important work. And I would say that it's not even a matter of lack of the sources for people to understand the conflict. It's a sheer disbelief that something so absurd may be happening, in fact. So each time that we are trying here in Poland to discuss this issue with so-called regular citizens, we are met with like this disbelief and this distance coming from the position that it's not possible that anyone would be like saying there are no such thing as two biological sexes. I think that, well, from the practical perspective, this document is, I think it can be applicable more to the English-speaking Western world, which in many cultural stances is in different place than we are with our political reality. So we have to select some pieces of it and then combine it into a new narrative, which happens to be we are happening to be organizing now. We are quite a few in Poland, radical feminists like standing up for women and women's rights, not being sorry and not being ashamed of using this word. So, and some of us are in a quite difficult position because my colleagues are crowdfunding to be able to sue their haters and sue people who were responsible for, in one case, for losing income sources from Instagram influencer who became a women's rights activist. In the other case, the case of Urszula Kuczyńska, she was expelled from left-wing political party, not even for like stating very controversial or women supportive words, but she was expelled. Even it was put this way in this document, that she was expelled for liking and sharing incorrect, like radical feminist content on social media. So it's quite absurd what we are experiencing now, but we are like, people are terrified to come up with their voices, to come up with their opinions, to take part in this discussion, because they are seeing what happens to these other women. So at the moment, what we are doing, we are trying to like get this perspective of having our voices heard and showing them that we cannot be like terrorized into silence. So for that,
I mean, Isa, a thing that we've found in the UK, and I think other countries, but certainly in the UK where I am, is that we've had some very good success with crowdfunders when there's been a case, and when we have a good issue. Often it's law cases. And so Maya Forstater, who just sort of won a recent case about it being legal, or it being allowed to not believe in gender identity ideology, it's allowed. She raised over £100,000 for defending her court case, and there have been a series of court cases where people have given money. And we get the feeling that there's quite a lot of people who have money, but they're scared to speak, but they will give money if they can. And it's been a surprise sometimes that we are being supported. So I definitely recommend giving it a try if you can, because you might it's actually helped the process of our resistance, the crowdfunding, because it's allowed people to support us who can't speak. So it's a sort of anonymous method of support. So it'd be interesting to see what happens when you start doing crowdfunding, if more supporters come out to help you. It would be great.
Well, we actually did start it already, so it's already happening, and we have something like fifth part needed already gathered. However, as I mentioned, your position is slightly different because we are presenting this topic to the Polish-speaking audience, and this Polish-speaking audience who is into the topic and familiar with it, it's a margin of a public in general. So there are not so many people involved, eager to support the case, but I would say that each day more, because the discussion and the style of this discussion that is happening online is very harsh, very aggressive. Anyone can see that women are being attacked. So people are each day more eager to support us, I would say. As we speak, I definitely understand the need to build a solidarity among us worldwide, but also I came to the conclusion that it's very, very important to build a solidarity and trust between different generations of women. And what we are lacking, especially in Poland right now, that the most popular mainstream feminists, so-called inclusive feminists, well, they are stealing young women for us. Like, we cannot get their attention enough, and we cannot get them on our side for some reason still. But I think that working on building this trust between ourselves and young women is essential.
We're going to go to Batya now. So Batya Weinbaum is from the USA. She's a feminist, author and educator, founder and editor of the journal FemSpec. She's an online instructor at American Public University. So thank you so much that you're going to talk about your experience of teaching early 21st century women and gender studies in an elite Southeastern American university, including the erasure of radical feminism and women's history from the curriculum, and the effect this is having on young people in the university. So over to you, Batya.
Yeah, so I want everyone on this network to know that this is a publication which is very supportive of this perspective that I've been sharing over the last couple months since I've been involved. And anybody who has stories or information or research might want to consider submitting to these people. It's a fine group of women very committed to this same struggle. And I was luckily connected with them for other reasons when I was teaching at a university, which I won't name. And I was invited to teach a capstone theory course about feminism, and I experienced a lot of bullying when I was there because my ideology was not in conformist lines with the kind of thinking that the department had. And I think also that my position in the university was compromised by being an adjunct. And I think that this has a terrible impact on women and girls because the majority of adjuncts are women, and so we have less freedom of speech and less academic freedom. And the consequences of obliterating radical feminism as a theoretical approach to teach from is that our freedom as scholars is impinged upon, and we can't do our research, and we can't do our teaching, and we can't do our thinking. It began for me when I was developing my my syllabus, and I was told, why didn't I have an anthology? And I did have an anthology. I had this anthology called Radical Feminism, and I was said to, why didn't I have this? Why didn't I have that? And I had a very historically developed approach about teaching what feminism was. And it didn't come to loggerheads until I was actually in the classroom. And the way I was teaching was to use Monica Saju and Barbara Moore's book on Great Cosmic Mother. And it started off, well, I started off with Ursula Le Guin, but once I started with the Great Cosmic Mother, the conflict started in the class because there were both men and women in the class. It was largely women. I asked them to turn a note card in the beginning of the class, telling me something significant about themselves that they wanted me to know. Nobody declared any pronoun or anything that they wanted me to address them as. But later I was called on the carpet for calling people with the wrong pronouns, but they had had a chance to declare to me what pronouns they wanted to call themselves. But the student complaint started when I was teaching the Great Cosmic Mother. And it took me a while to understand that because of the trans ideology, the starting point of women as reproducers was an uncomfortable, unpopular starting point. I was teaching not only the Great Cosmic Mother, but I was having them do artwork based on the images in the book and intuitively connecting with these archetypes. And so my way of teaching was also not supported. But the most important thing was the next book was about Elizabeth Barber's women's work, the first 20,000 years. And she has an analysis of how women's participation in the workforce was organized around their birthing and ability to take care of children. And so for, 20,000 years, this was how we arrived at our position in the work world. And this was resisted too, because people wanted to say that women weren't being defined by their wombs, because women didn't have to have a vagina to be a woman. And, all this ideology started seeping back up towards me in the classroom, which was at odds with what I was teaching. And best analogy I can make is if you're teaching German history and then somebody keeps wanting to talk about what's going on in Latin America, or if you're teaching trigonometry and somebody wants to talk about nuclear physics. I mean, there was a project going on in the course that I was starting with. There was a time when women's reproductive power was a power, and if we trace it all the way through patriarchal society, it gets diminished and defined as a liability, to the point where feminist theorists like Shulman Firestone were saying we'd be better off with artificial wombs. And I was trying to pull this thread, across thousands of years, across the millennial, but I wasn't allowed to. And one of the ways in which the class was disrupted was the way I taught was to invite people to do footnotes, so that when topics came up in the class that people wanted to know more about, they could get credit, or it was an assignment that they had to do a footnote, further research on something that came up in class. And so at one point, this worked for most people, but there was a little group of people that were starting to criticize me for defining women in essentialist terms as being bearers of children and being defined by reproduction in their wombs. I was criticized for being essentialist, but I want to point out that essentialism was really a Greek term among male philosophers. And in terms of when feminists started using the term essentialist to attack other feminists, it was when they started to get integrated into the university and were using male ideological systems to sort of diminish the revolutionary cutting edge of many feminists who were in the university trying to pursue feminist revolution rather than to, structure a professional discipline of women's studies. And so by the time I was there, there was just a very disruptive. I would teach, and then some of the students would go to complain to the women's studies director, and she would get back to me and start telling me how I should teach in the classroom and what I should say and what I shouldn't say. I shouldn't talk from personal experience. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't do that. And the footnote problem became an issue because there was a student who wanted to do her presentation on Gender Outlaw, which was a book of collections of really the trans experience. And she wanted to make the argument that the work of passing as women was so difficult that this was part of women's work, which had nothing to do with the classroom. I mean, I could have taught a whole course on the trans movement, but that's not what I was teaching about. So I was saying, well, I don't really think, that's relevant. And then I was confronted in the class. Well, yes, there's many ways you can spin this. So the students were telling me what was acceptable and what was necessary to include. And the day that the students gave, this one student and then the cohort of supporters gave this presentation on Gender Outlaw, there was a quote that somebody said in the presentation that it was so much work to pass as a woman, forget the movement. And I picked up on that and I said, yeah, that's the exact criticism that radical feminists have made, is that there's so much work towards trying to pass, all of this is a deflection from the feminist movement, which is trying to change patriarchy and change patriarchal models and change patriarchal roles, rather than having to work to fit into them, flipping from one to the other. And believe it or not, that was the last day that I was allowed to teach. The next thing I knew, I was told to meet in the chair's office with the director of women's studies, and I was not aware of what was happening at all. And I was simply told that I was going to be removed from the classroom. And at this point, it wasn't even that I was removed from that classroom, but I was smeared with an email that the director of women's studies sent not only to this entire class about why I had to be removed, but to another class that I was teaching with a lot of success, the Introduction to Women and Gender Studies, that I was teaching online. And those students were confused as to why they got an attack from the director of Women and Gender Studies about me. But when I was meeting with the chair of the department and the director of Women's Studies, we were inside a sociology department. I was suggesting that some of the dissidence of the students was based on the fact that they weren't following through with the course, but were trying to change what was going on in the course, and that the ideology that they were expressing would get a chance to be discussed towards the end of the course when we finally got there and talked about the role of technology in altering gender roles. And the chair actually said, well, they have their own culture. So the whole administration was more of, afraid of the students and interested in placating the culture of the students than in actually performing education. And the detriment on women and girls is that all of this women's work, the first 20,000 years, the radical feminist anthology, all of these topics were just thrown out. And the students, by declaring what they thought should be taught, which I'm usually a student-centered teacher, so it's not that I'm not interested in listening to students, but this particular cadre of students really, in my view, interfered with the education of other people in the class, because this kind of thinking, this kind of approach that I was ready to offer was not acceptable. And the chair from the outside was telling me that I had to conform to whatever culture the students had, which is not really what education is supposed to be about. From my point of view, I mean, that maybe I date myself, but I was in the university to learn from the professors that I had and was impressed with their knowledge, and these students just didn't have that perspective at all. And the problem is that I was talking about women based on women's bodies being organized around reproduction, and this was reprehensible to the trans cult ideology, which was saying that women's bodies had nothing to do with whether women were women or not. And so, at any rate, in conclusion, I think that it's really a shame that women in gender studies students are not learning radical feminism, and that radical feminism is being eradicated and teachers are being thrown out. I wasn't hired again, actually, after this. And that the institutionalized postmodern, post-feminist women in gender studies doesn't recognize that radical feminists have anything to teach. And my position is that it's sometimes is better to ask students to grow up rather than to coddle and to placate them and to allow them to bully a professor. and that sometimes educating students beyond what they already think might be good for them. I even offered to do a whole course on female erasure based on that anthology, Female Erasure, which follows the conflicts between feminism and the transgender movement, you know, in very specific ways, and theoretical ways, and political ways. But it seems that the burying of radical feminist thought from the current students of women and gender studies might be a disservice to the development of feminist consciousness as a whole, because women and gender studies, after all, got its origin from the impetus of the women's movement. And so to eclipse the origins of the women's movement from what happens in women and gender studies, to cut it off at the base and then to flip it and to only allow the transgender discussions to go on in the classroom is just an incredible disservice, because the students don't even know why they're there. They don't even know why those classrooms were created. So I don't see how feminist consciousness is being developed when this is allowed to go on in the classroom. And they look at people like me or people from our generation or people with radical feminist thinking as people who are, you know, leftovers, dinosaurs that are about to be buried by the iceberg. And that's just a funny twist, because radical feminists used to be accused of being ahistorical, and now radical feminists are being told that they're too historical, and we want to just teach about the past 50 years. We don't want to teach about, you know, 250,000 years that led up to the past 50 years. And so the other issue I found was that inclusivity meant to the current women and gender studies to include trans people and trans ideology, and not to include a whole wide range of feminists or women who might be able to read and use theory outside of the universities, is a very truncated view of what women and gender studies is. And that I think the aggressive actions of some pushing of the trans line deprives other students of processes that broaden and deepen their education. And this is a real detriment. And I also noticed among the students that when this conflict arose, that there were codependent young women who were being seduced into thinking that other people's experiences were more important than their own. So it's more important to look at how this very small group of people, the trans people, suffered, and to allow that to eclipse looking at the whole history of women, and allow that to eclipse looking at their own experience. And I thought that this was from codependency of young women who didn't think that their own issues were important enough to look at. And that's what I saw the dynamic of happening in the class. And the problem is it took us 50 years to fight, to resist, reclaim, and imagine and reimagine the history of women that had been left and suppressed and left out and buried. And now, once we've dug it up, it's being buried again. And it's happening very quickly under this ideology of the trans cult. And so I think that the gender identity dominance and the queer studies dominance are being inserted over what women's studies was originally. And I think it's really a shame. I just wanted to show this image and talk about how, you know, the burning of the professor, we're not so far from witch burning. And that's exactly what the experience was of, for me, trying to teach radical feminism where a trans culture was dominant in the university. It used to be, all the years I worked in academia, that to go to the women's lands and to go to the women's music festivals was a place to get reinforced about what my identity was and what I was trying to bring to the university. But those platforms have been eroded too by the same invasion of the trans culture. And so I find that there is a need. I do a lot of intergenerational work on the journal and on the land that I have. And there are women who are really thirsty and starving to find out what it is that we know that we're not allowed to offer in either of those venues anymore.